I'm not going anywhere. So
All right, cool. Well, I started recording, so yeah. So tell me, what have you been working on?
that's been almost exclusively audiobooks this year, you know. So um, I think there were 53. I did 53 this year, or I will have done 53 by the time the year's up. Which I think is like I wrote it all down. It was like 610 hours of audio or something. It's a lot of audiobook. Um, so I stayed really busy. Stayed really busy. I moved. It was a busy year.
Where'd you move from?
I normally lived in Seattle, and I and my family moved to the other side of the state to Spokane right before COVID, basically.
Yeah.
Um, which actually worked out great because it's not as crowded here, and so it was a good move. And the place is a little bigger, so now that we're all in here all the time, every day,
You get very, very comfortable, very
makes things a
close
little easier.
quarters.
Makes things a little bit easier, especially when your kids are, schooling from home and stuff like that. So
Yeah. Well, I see you're in your studio there. Is
I
that your
am.
favorite spot? That's
I
your
am. It's nice.
sanctuary?
It's nice. Nobody else ever comes in here. So
Is there a lock on the
it's
door?
quiet. Actually, I think you know what? My previous one did, but this one does not. But they know better. Besides, there's not that much room.
Okay, awesome. Well, we are here with Travis Baldree, the illustrious narrator of Blood and Oak, written by yours truly, Garrett Betancourt, of course. And we have the books in the background there. But basically, I just wanted to take the opportunity to ask you about your craft because it's as interesting for me to find out as anyone else because, I listen to the whole production and I I'm kind of amazed by what you put together and so yeah, I put together some questions and thought we'd just
Fabulous.
pick your brain a little. What do you think?
Sounds great. Sounds great. I love talking. So
You're in good company. Awesome. Well, so why don't we start with the obvious? What got you into audiobooks and how long have you been doing it?
Um, well, I read to my family for years and years and years. I'm sure lots of people say that, but I read to my wife before we had kids. I read to my kids. Um, I I've enjoyed doing it, and I also really liked. We used to listen to audiobooks all the time when we drove places back in days of yore when anyone drove anywhere. Um, so
Yeah.
uh, I've always liked audiobooks. Frank Muller is like one of my favorite narrators of all time. I don't know how much of his stuff I'd listened to over and over. But eventually my kids didn't need me to read to them anymore and didn't want me to. And coincident with that, um, because I also own and operate a game studio, we were doing a lot of audio work and I didn't want to pay to go use a studio. So I ended up
Yeah.
getting the equipment to record properly for game VO. And at the same time, I had heard about ACX, which you used, obviously. We used as the intermediary for publishing Blood and Oak, um, and thought maybe I will give this a try. This might be fun. I think I did a couple of short stories just to kind of get my feet wet for LibriVox, which does public domain audiobooks, and a lot of people just kind of tested out with that. Um, but then I got on ACX, got some books pretty quick and just started doing it and then discovered that I loved doing it. Um, I guess I've been doing it for about 4 years now, something like that.
4 years.
Um,
Wow. And
yeah,
you've had it seems like you've had a pretty huge portfolio built up in 4 years. So that must be a pretty fast rise.
I think I've done about 120 books or so at this point. A
That's
large
amazing.
number of those in the last year, because this last year's the first year that I've done it close to full time. It's been mostly full time, and as you do it over time, you sort of advance your process for doing it. You figure out your limitations, and the amount of time it takes you to produce a book starts to go down, which is good because if you get more books, you need it.
Yeah. And I've had that experience with writing. It's like, the more you write, your production time starts to go down.
Exactly.
So are you with your, so you started with the gaming
Hmm.
company at the creator of Outlaw Galaxy.
Rebel
Rebel
Galaxy Outlaw is the
Galaxy.
latest one. Yep.
Rebel Galaxy Outlaws the new one, and you started with Rebel Galaxy.
Yeah. And before that, I ran Runic Games. We made Torchlight. Before that, a game called Fate. So I've been making games for 20 something years at this point. But at this
Yeah.
point, I've effectively kind of retired from it. I
Yeah.
love it, but I love doing this an awful lot. And the stress level differential is hard to quantify. Um, because games are like putting a big pile of money in the middle of the table and lighting it on fire and hoping that you will make a new pile of money appear once that one has burned away. And it's a matter of years before what you worked on actually comes out. And the world is not the same as when you started. And it's just a really different kind of creative prospect. And audiobooks are something that you start and finish in a week, and that you're always partnered with somebody. You're never pulling it all out of the mud by yourself. Somebody else has already done most of the heavy lifting, and you get to come on and put the whipped cream on top.
Yeah.
And that's really, I mean, I really enjoy doing it, and it's for me, it's been maybe like a healthier way to work.
Yeah. So with Rebel Galaxy, what gave you? Have you been using your studio for games for a long time?
It's a totally separate company. The company that I make games with is called Double Damage. It still exists. We just put out the console versions for the Switch and PS4 and Xbox One for Rebel Galaxy Outlaw just a couple of months ago. But it's really just kind of more operational at this point. And I make audiobooks completely independent of that. That's my own separate thing. I have a co-owner of my game studio, but everything's more or less dependent on me making games, so it's just sort of coasted down at this point.
Yeah. Well, I am like super nervous if you can't tell. So
No
I've
reason to
never
be
done.
nervous.
I know. It's like
We all have this Zoom practice over the last
I
eight
know,
or 10 months, right? This is how everybody talks to everybody now.
but I want to make you look good. So
Oh no, there's nothing you can do about that. This is COVID hair and everything. You don't have to worry about anything at all.
Well, so what was you mentioned that so you were in a previous industry and that was really stressful, and then you decided I used to read books to my family and my kids,
Hmm.
and you made that transition into narrating audiobooks, and you felt like that was a big step down in stress level.
Oh yeah.
um
It's just
you
also
ha-
it's a very different kind of industry. It's really creatively
yeah,
rewarding, and it's just one of the nicest industries I've ever. It feels like it's like secretly nice. Like I've
really.
never worked within an industry where everybody was so genuinely nice to each other, so helpful of each other. It doesn't matter if you're the best narrator on the planet, the most widely regarded, that person's going to sit down with somebody who's brand new and give them a hand, and it's just night and day to any other industry I've ever worked in. It's really pleasant. It's really diverse. Tons of tons of diversity as an industry compared to any other industry I've ever been in. It's just really, really pleasant to be in.
That's really cool. And it sounds like you're in a very like peaceful place
I
doing
am.
this.
It's very zen. Well, one of the things I like the most about audiobook narration is obviously I like to read, which is pretty helpful if you're going to
Yeah.
narrate books. But one of the great things about reading books out loud and performing them is that basically I get the best possible version of a book that I can get, right? If I'm
Yeah.
sitting down and reading to myself, I get interrupted, I skim, I don't necessarily wring all the good out of the book. But when you perform it for yourself out loud, you're getting like you have to think about everything. You're never glossing over what the author was intending or not investing it with the energy that it needed to be invested with to hit right. So you just get the best possible version of a book. So if I had infinite time, I would never read a book silently in my head. At this point, I'd read it out loud because I get a better version of it. So it's really rewarding in that respect, even just for myself.
Yeah, that's actually a great segue too into a question I had from a reader, which is, do you feel that you get more out of a book narrating it than just reading it?
Oh,
What?
absolutely. Absolutely. Because if you want to
Yeah,
give that to somebody else, you got to give it to yourself first.
yeah. That's a what. So, what would you say are your favorite books to read? What are your favorite authors?
Um, I mean, I like almost anything as long as it's got a really relatable human component to it. For me, characters are the main thing. And so I'm kind of continuously surprised by what I like. Books that I might never have thought to read. This is another cool aspect of the gig, is that you're not just reading what you would pick up from a jacket cover or from a review. You've got a wide variety of stuff that you read, and you're constantly surprised by how much you love the things that you read. For me, it's almost always because of characters and relationships and just real human elements that are exposed in the writing. That's what I love.
Yeah, those are some of the things I love the most too. That makes a lot of sense, and you get that relationship with the character because you're actually performing them.
Yep. Yep. You're
That
trying to
must
make sure
be,
that those emotional beats land. So it's really rewarding that way. And I have no acting background. I think the only acting thing I ever did was I was Good King Wenceslas in the church play in fourth grade. So I don't have like the I don't think I don't have a standard acting background, but I love it and I love the craft of it. There's so many things to think about. There's so many interesting nitty-gritty details to narrating and trying to be true to what the author is attempting to get across that I when I was younger, I never would have expected I wanted to do this. It was a
yeah.
bit of a surprise to me.
What would you say is kind of the most surprising book that you've read that you feel like you wouldn't have normally picked it up, but because you do this gig, you picked it up and you read it and you're like, wow.
Um, one of there was a series I read just this year. It was called Pixel Dust series. It was David Petrie, and it's game lit, which is a relatively modern genre. It's relatively new. It usually involves being in a game or a game world or people playing in a game together. There's some element of gaming to it, right? And a lot of them are really focused on the mechanics of games and gamerdom and stuff like this. But was really this one was about relationships. It was about gender identity. It was about all of these really interesting, kindly human things in the context of a game. And I thought that was amazing. It was the weepiest book of the year for me, bar none. And it was just not what I expected going in. I didn't expect to be that moved by it. And I didn't expect for it to have that much that it wanted to say.
Do you play games at all, or?
I mean, I do. I'm really picky about them. It helps to play
Yeah,
games if you make games, but it's like
well,
kind of like
that's a good
anything. You
point.
get really picky about stuff that you do. So if I'm just reading for pleasure, I end up funneling myself more than I probably should. But as a result of narrating, I have such a variety of stuff to read. It's
Yeah,
it's actually kind of good for me. I actually don't get that much like pleasure reading time anymore.
yeah, I know the feel. I have the guilt of like, if I'm reading, I should be
I
writing, and if
should be
I'm
writing
writing,
something.
I should be reading more. But
Exactly.
so, do you have a going back to kind of your skills and the background? You weren't really into acting. Your standout role in Good King Wenceslas notwithstanding. Do you have like a mentor or a major influence that's helped you kind of get into this, or?
Um, I mean, I've done coaching with various coaches. You spend a half an hour here, a half hour there. You talk about things a lot in the audiobook narration community. I don't have a specific mentor. Like I said earlier, Frank Muller was a narrator that I always just thought was incredible, and I've listened to his work so much. Jim Dale's also really fantastic. Um, George Woodall, there are a lot of amazing narrators that I look up to and think are great, and I think you absorb a lot as you're listening to the way that people evoke a story. So most of I think or a lot of what I have picked up has been from just listening to other people who I think are really good. And
It's like that Stephen King, axiom that he lives by. It's like, you to be a good writer, you have to read a lot. And it sounds like to be a good
yeah,
narrator, it's the same deal. You got to read a lot, you got to
yeah,
absorb it, and you've
yeah,
got to listen a lot to the other narrators.
yeah.
What's like something Frank Muller did that was just really like a signature thing for you?
Um, I thought he had a really good way of having really naturalistic, human sounding dialogue. and he really naturally stitched it together with the surrounding narrative. So when Frank Muller would deliver something, and he really acted it out, he wasn't one of those narrators that reads dialogue. He definitely performed it. He had a really great way of segueing it into like an attribution, so that it was all just, there's this very naturalistic music to it, where the attribution kind of just bled away, and you're really just thinking about what somebody said. And I was really admired how seamlessly he interwove dialogue with the surrounding narrative.
Can you think of like a book that was just like a great signature book for him?
Green Mile, The Green Mile, Stephen King's The Green Mile is probably my
Awesome.
favorite audiobook of all time. It's fabulous. So go listen to
Yeah.
that. It's great.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion. I definitely want to listen to that. Give me 1 second here. My dad's dog is she's not happy because she can't come into this room.
I couldn't hear a thing though.
Oh, okay. Well, that's good. What would you say? What would you say is one of your goals you've set for yourself as a narrator that you've achieved?
Achieved. Um,
Or what are some of the desires that you want to get out of it?
Over time, I'd really just like to continue to increase the variety of books that I do.
Hmm.
I like almost everything. I'm generally fiction focused. I don't really do nonfiction, not because I don't think nonfiction is interesting, but it's not one of the things that I love about narration is the kind of the performative aspect. So just about any kind of fiction, I'd like to continue to expand, the kinds of things that I get to do. I'm starting to try my hand at some romance these days because I discovered it's actually really enjoyable. I'm not like a romance reader, but after reading excerpts from some and doing some where I had to do like a small dual part for a larger book, I discovered that I really like it. It's like it's just really pleasant. I did
Yeah.
a fantasy romance series that I ended up it was one of my favorite books to do. It was like having chicken soup. It was just really pleasant. So
Well, you've
um
got those dulcet tones, you might as well.
so yeah, just doing more, doing more variety, working with new authors. It's always cool to work with new authors.
Once Marley, come here. I want to show you.
Got to introduce the dog.
Okay.
There we go.
That's Marley.
Oh, so cute. So cute.
Could you voice Marley? Say, I'm
No,
looking for a
bark, bark.
narrator. It's my dad's dog, Jack Russell.
What a cutie.
She'll be running around, I'm sure. She might bark, just so you know.
No stress here.
So what? Okay, we talked about your favorite narrator. We talked about your favorite narrated book, The Green Mile. What would you say, aside from narration, just a book you've just read? What would you say is like your favorite book?
Oh, my favorite book. Wow. It would probably change every year. Um,
I know it's
I,
always a
I
hard
like
question.
that's a really hard question. That's a really hard question because I like a lot of stuff for a lot of different reasons. I'm not
Well,
sure if
maybe a
I could actually
handful,
pull.
maybe a couple of books that you like.
I've
I
always
do get
liked
that
Stephen
question.
King. I love Stephen King's work.
Mhm.
Um, I oh man, uh, Robert Jackson Bennett, really great author. City of Stairs and um, American Elsewhere, and I love him a lot. Who else? Um, oh gosh, one of my favorite books of the last few years was The Library at Mount Char, and the author's name is escaping me at the moment. It was his first book. I think he had talked about doing a follow-up, and I don't know if he ever got around to it, but it was just I really enjoyed it. Um, I've also been enjoying I liked Gideon the Ninth is a recent favorite. I really loved the language. It had it was this combination of really sort of Baroque, elaborate language with profanity and comedy that I'd never read anything like it before.
That's you could actually put together a great reading list, I bet.
I don't know, maybe,
You should
maybe.
consider that. Travis Baldree's essential reading.
Somebody might look at it.
Absolutely. I'm pretty interested.
I bet you've
What
got quite the reading list.
you would think. I kind of have films in my head, and writing is my best way to get them out right now. So I'm actually kind of more of a film buff than I am
Hmm.
an avid reader, but I do read a lot of books, and most of them are audiobooks. That's actually one of the reasons I was so interested in having a narrator do Blood and Oak, and it kind of became a dream of mine because I just didn't have time, but in traffic you can listen to an audiobook. That's one of the things about what you do that's so valuable, is that you can experience it, in a way. You have that perfect focus on every word, and then you can do other things, right?
Yep. Yep. I love audiobooks. And the the biggest downside to becoming a narrator is that you can't listen to audiobooks while you work.
You know what? That is a pickle, and it's yours to solve, my friend.
I don't think I'm ever going to
I
crack
can't
that
help
one.
you.
I don't think I'm ever going to crack that one.
So, what would you say? Well, how do you feel about where you're at in your career as a narrator? Do you feel like are you feel like you're starting to hit your stride, or do you feel like you've had a lot of success, or do you feel like there's a lot more you want to do?
I feel really fortunate. I have really consistent work. People bring me books. I don't really have to hustle. It's amazing. I'm booked out for 10 to 12 months. So I
Wow.
cannot complain. I feel very fortunate. Um, and I love the work, and I have no complaints. Um, Looking forward, it's really just, you know, new publishers, new authors, just expanding kind of the range of my experience, and being allowed to keep doing it. Hopefully the hopper stays full and I continue to have work going forward, because I
Yeah.
really love doing it.
I think it will. I get great uh, feedback all the time on your performance, and I loved it. One of the interesting things that you asked me to do when we were in the production process was, to go through and listen to every word, right, and then recommend changes, or fine tune some things. And I'll never forget that for me, that experience was extremely powerful, because when I read my own work, my mind fills in blanks and it skips over things that I know are coming and that I'm
Yeah.
not as focused on. And so I have a hard time actually reading it. But when I heard it in your performance all the way through, and I had to hear every single word, it was the first time I'd ever experienced my book as a reader. And I think that what was so interesting about that is that there was there was a lot of it that was reinterpreted, and it made me realize what you're doing is very much an art form. And I'm glad that I placed that trust in you, to interpret characters a little differently than maybe I imagined in my head, because by the end of it, I felt like the audience.
Yeah.
So,
And in a lot of ways, it's like getting a movie adaptation where you don't have control over the casting.
right.
There's just, and it's ultimately it's an adaptation, and there's so many ways that something can be read. There's just infinite ways that a single sentence can be read. And, um, my hope is in doing it that I'm respecting what you intended, that like the feeling comes across that you want to get across. That's like the main thing. There's all kinds of concessions and things that you do to make sure that the audio will be understandable for the person who's going to be listening to it.
Yeah.
Separating out character voices, variations on accent, things that you do to make sure that people know what's happening. They don't have to think about it, and they can just be in the book. And then there's just the raw interpretation of the text as it was. And the book was fantastically written. I loved it, and it was really a joy to do. Um,
Oh,
and
well,
it
thank
was
you.
very cinematic. You can kind of tell how much you like movies because there's a really cinematic element to it. Just the way that things are described, the presentation, the way that action is choreographed. And so
No, stop.
when I'm reading, I do it as a mental movie. So in my head, for
Yeah.
me, I think it's important to see what's going on, because there's all kinds of weird subtleties in the way that you deliver that will be informed by what you say in your head. Something as simple as like, is somebody standing on the stairs up above you? Then when you're talking to that person, you lift your chin a little bit and you say, and you elevate your voice. And there's all these strange little changes and nuances that happen if you've got a strong mental picture of what's going on. So the stronger the mental picture is that the author puts down, the closer that mental movie is going to be in my head. And ideally, the closer the way that I deliver it will be to what they intended. So that's the hope anyway.
Yeah, that's very true. And a testament to that is I really had very few changes I felt needed to be made in the final cut. I mean, it was like it was literal very small things, and most of it, and you and I even kind of, there was one area where I was slightly in disagreement with your interpretation, and that was Captain Bainbridge.
Yes.
And it was purely because in the historical record, he's 29 years old at the time of this story,
Yep.
and your interpretation, you were kind of basing it. And I want to ask you about how you cast your characters in a moment, but like you kind of cast him as slightly older sounding voice. And I remember that I kind of asked for a
It
change, and
was
you kind of
Jonathan
pushed.
Price in my head, I think.
Yes, Jonathan Price, which great actor, really interesting way take on it. And you kind of push back, and you asked me to like say to sort of just trust the performance and let it breathe, and just you kind of, what was your reasoning behind that?
For me, the casting is mostly about the tone of the character and the way that they deliver lines and their attitude, right? Obviously, age matters, but it only
Hmm.
matters so much because I'm obviously not 29 and I'm not
Right.
60 and I'm not
Right.
80. So there's a certain expectation of interpretation already with an audiobook. I'm not a lady either.
Yeah.
And there's the one scene where the girl is disguised as a
As a
man
man.
singing a song and pretending to use the voice of a man.
Yeah, that's a tongue twister. I remember
And
she's a
so I mean,
woman
there's
that
all these
disguises as a man, singing a
pretending to be
song,
another man,
imitating a man. Yes.
imitating another man. Um,
that was very that was quite a piece of talent on your part, I have to admit.
so for me, with that specific character, his age didn't bear into the narrative in a significant way, and I don't know if his age was actually ever mentioned. So I'm sure you had it in your
Probably
notes,
not,
but I
no.
can't. I don't believe it was actually mentioned in the text. So from a reader perspective, it wasn't important information. But the tone of the character was. And so since there's this certain amount of latitude of interpretation, the character was more important to me than the age. So if I could give him the character that I thought was important for the lines he was doing and the kind of person that he was, and it was very easy for me to imagine that kind of Jonathan Price character. I mean, even from like he's like in
Yeah.
what Pirates of the Caribbean, and there's just something about the attitude that he had in that I thought mapped really well. So it was an easy way for me to kind of firm that up in my mind. And ideally, that means that when he's delivering lines, they have the attitude and the feeling that you want, even if he's not, according to the historical record, the exact right age. Um, it's kind of like how everybody is in a gladiator movie all has a British accent.
Yeah. Or a North Atlantic
Or
accent,
North
maybe.
Atlantic, yeah.
Well, I
And
think
obviously, we're not going that far, but
I'm glad I trusted it too, because in the when I actually listened to it back, you're right. The tone, and because he's a character that's very rigid and sort of aristocratic in how he views things, and that plays into his conflict with the main character John. And so your interpretation winds up actually really making his scenes just they come across exactly as I hoped they would,
yeah.
even though the interpretation of the voice might be different. So in the final summation, I think it's a fascinating process because you've interpreted the art, and that has sort of informed me,
Yeah.
which is really powerful, I think.
And
So
one
let
of the
me,
things I think that's
yeah, go
important
ahead.
in audiobooks is always contrast because you put one of the hardest scenes to ever do in audiobooks is a bunch of people the same age from the same place in the same room having a conversation
And all
because
imitating a man. No.
there's very little contrast, right?
Yeah.
Because if you got a bunch of people who are 20 years old who are from the same town, who all go to the same school, who all have known each other forever, there's not a lot of you're not going to put an accent on to separate them, and there's no age to separate them. So for me, contrasts are always important. And especially if you've got things that have conflict, if you have characters that have conflict, or if you have characters that are comedic foils versus the straight man. Always having
Hmm.
contrast in those situations is really important to making that work. So I will always sacrifice a little bit for, for perfect authenticity in order to get contrasts that I think will serve the interactions that they have with other characters.
Yeah. But so West Side Story, is that not in your future?
Gosh, I hope not. It'd be way too much singing.
Way too much singing, all same age, same, same social strata. Um, well, let me ask you about your process. So when you're taking on a new project, you kind of have like a series of steps you go through,
Hmm.
um, sort of the pre-production, if you will. And how do you figure out what voice the characters are going to have, how they're going to speak? How do you work that out with the author?
So it's different for every book because my involvement with the authors is different with every book. And some authors are hands off, some aren't even alive. Um, some you don't have contact through because you're going through a publisher that doesn't supply that contact. So there's a really wide range of ways that I end up approaching it. Um, if I do have contact with the author, well, here's my basic process. I do a couple of steps early on in my prep, and I am not an exhaustive prepper because I like the book to be pretty live when I read it. I like to be enjoying it and to be at the same place that the listener is going to be when I read it. But that doesn't mean I can't not read it. So I do what I call a skim read, which means I know who all the characters are. I know what everybody's accents are. I know the shape of the narrative. I know the basic beats of the whole story. I know where it's going, but I haven't obsessed over individual lines. Um, Also, the kind of story matters to a certain extent. If I'm reading fantasy and it's got tons of made up words, I run everything through Word and I just run the spell checker and it will find all the weird stuff. And so I immediately
Huh.
scrape all of that out and I put it in a big document and I'll write down my phonetic expected pronunciation for everything. With something like Blood and Oak, where you've got actual, language things that need to be looked up, I'll separate those out and look up pronunciations unless they're already provided for me. And if there's stuff that I don't know that I need to clarify with the author, I'll send those pronunciations along and get sign off on them so that I make sure I don't pronounce them incorrectly. On the character front, generally I try and find the mains, anybody who's important or is going to persist or is suddenly going to become important in 3 books. They had
Yes.
one line and then 3 books later, all of a sudden they're a main character, which happens. Um, and I'll do basically a mental movie cast. This is if I was making a movie, here's who I would put in that role because that helps me because then I can visualize the scenes. I want to know who's what. I want to be able to have that mental movie. So it's really useful for me. And if I have contact with the author and they are involved in that process and want to be, it's an easy way for me to check and make sure that we're on the same page, just like with Jonathan
Yeah.
Pryce, right? Because it's an easy way for them to say, "Oh God, why would you cast Brian Blessed in that role? This guy should totally be Anthony Hopkins or something." That I can
Right.
have that immediate feedback that makes sure that we don't have really big tonal inconsistencies where I'm obviously not getting what the author wanted. And usually I'm pretty close. There's usually maybe a character that they'll want to tweak.
Yeah,
Um,
that's a really interesting point too, because that was the process that we went through, and I remember we kind of did an IMDb list
mhm.
of each actor you visualized, and you said something in that process that I found really interesting, which was, the purpose of this list of actors matching to characters is not so I can mimic the actor, it's so I can have sort of a baseline tone, voice, something along those lines
Yeah.
to
Because you don't
match
want
with
to,
it.
nobody wants to listen to me do impersonations of people, and that's distracting. And I
Right.
think it ultimately it's destructive to the because then you're just like, oh wow, they're trying to sound like Christian Slater.
Yeah.
You don't want that. But just having them in mind, just the physicality of somebody. Is it a big jowly guy? If it's Carl Malden, you let your jowls go because that's the way he's. There's physical changes that you do that don't necessarily ape the person, but that inform how they're going to be read.
Right. And it's a very interesting process too, because it really helps you zero in on how many different roles you have to do and how to contrast them. Like you were saying, you need contrast. And I
Yep.
remember it wasn't until I got the list back of these are all the words I need to know how to pronounce. And I'm kind of thinking this character for that one. I suddenly realized, wow, when I wrote this thing, I never thought about how hard it would be to do a narrated copy. But I think your response to that was you kind of enjoyed the challenge. Is that usually your
Oh yeah.
experience?
Yeah. I mean, if you don't enjoy it, you're not going to want to do this job. I had a book uh, that had, I think it was 65 female characters and two guys. And
Wow, life on hard mode.
it was an alternate history fantasy kind of like Western where there was like one man born for every 30 women. So there was these huge families of women and they would have like one son. So it's all these sisters who are only identified by name,
That's
all from the same
fascinating.
place that have the one guy. And the reason it was a male narration is because he was the ostensibly the main character and it was from his perspective, but all of the secondary characters were females. And almost all of them had the exact same accent and didn't have any differentiating features whatsoever apart from their names.
That's quite a challenge.
So after
Because
that, everything's easy.
it's quite to your credit because one of the interesting things for me when you're as an author selecting someone to be a narrator, that's important. How a narrator does the opposite gender is always interesting to listen to because I've listened to um, other authors with female narrators, and the way they do men is like it's important to the narrative. And good narrators are good at this, I think, because they don't mimic. They capture the they capture the emotions and the expression of the character without trying to actually mimic the opposite gender's voice. And I think you do that really well. And for me, I just after I'm in it, it just disappears. So do you have a philosophy around that, or do you have a
I
kind of
do.
a
I've done whole
skill you've
videos
learned?
on this. I've done whole
Yeah.
videos on this and how to do it. You know, um, I think it's just important to not treat it as your female voice. Well, every female character is a character and just deserves the same amount of attention as a male character. And you don't just put on a falsetto and
Absolutely.
go with it. There are things that I do to make them sound more female, but you're never going to imagine that I am suddenly a woman during reading this. It's just not going to happen. But there's things that you do as far as your vocal placement, in
Hmm.
in your throat and in your chest where you're placing them. And for me, it's about finding a baseline location. Like when I speak as a man, I'm vibrating here in my chest. But if I start to go higher and if I start to bring it up range, your voice basically moves up your throat and it moves into your mouth and closer to your palate. And so you do this certain amount of softening with that. And then there's just differences in diction and in kind of the musicality of the delivery that are some partially character and partially kind of like gender tied to a certain extent. So you do a mix of all of those things with the personality of the character and who they actually are, and then you layer accents on top of that, and then that's the person. Um, but definitely a bunch of thought goes into it, and there's a lot of schools of thought on it. I mean, it's not like there's just one way to narrate books that everybody agrees on. So
Very true. Well, what do you think has been kind of what's been sort of a breakthrough moment in your journey becoming a narrator?
um, I think for me, probably one of the biggest changes for either my career or just the way that I worked. Probably a couple of things. One, I ended up narrating Will White's Cradle series, which ended up being really popular, and I have ended up. It's done a lot for me and my career just because it. Will has been really successful self-publishing, and he has a huge fan base, and so just from a pure career perspective, that was really good for me. And a lot of work came my way as a result of that, and people listened to me who might not otherwise have, and so that was really good for me. In the past year, one of the things that's been like a big change for me is I basically live work at this point. I am online streaming my work every day. So I use Discord, which is kind of a gaming focused generally chat.
Yeah, I
that
know
allows you to also
Discord.
use, so you know
Why am I
Discord.
not on your
But
channel?
other
I
other
need to
other
tune
people
in.
might not know Discord. Anyway, I have a Discord. I have a Discord server, and I narrate on it just about every day, as long as I have the rights holders' approval to do so, because nothing's recorded. So you can drop in and you can watch me work, and I'll chat with people in the chat. And it's, especially in the time of COVID, it's very nice to be able to interact with people in what is generally kind of a lonely job. Um, and so that's been really great for me. Not only is it just great in terms of not being quite so isolated, it's also really great for my productivity because I get a lot more work done that way when I know somebody might be listening. You can't just get up and go get snacks.
Oh yes, you've got a built-in motivator.
You got a built-in motor. You stay on schedule. You get your work done.
Yeah. Do you get good feedback on your on performance? It kind of helps you fine tune things from that.
For the most part, no. People let me do my thing. Um, we laugh and joke together sometimes. Sometimes I get people to look up pronunciations for me on the fly.
Now that's helpful. You've got
um,
online gophers.
got a little bit of a, but for the most part, no. People don't say, "Gosh, would you read that a different way?" Or "What, do you think that was successful?" A lot of times, authors will come in and listen. I've had authors listen to their whole books done, and they're always real good about not poking me. So I appreciate that.
I was going to ask you too, how's your family with your process? Are they pretty supportive or
Oh yeah,
um,
and compared to games, the amount of time I spend in doing this is much, much less impactful. It's just better for me as far as family goes. You know, these days my booth is pretty thick, so I weather most noises. Although occasionally I do have to go upstairs and ask my youngest not to be an elephant right around there. But
yeah.
it's not too bad. It's not too bad. After we moved, that was one of the nice things is, it's a little bit more separated location, and it's easier not to be impacted by laundry or dishwashers or vacuum
Yeah.
cleaners.
That must be nice. A soundproof booth. Maybe I should invest in one as my writing room. And I wonder, well, this, I guess you wouldn't have this problem, but just throw this out there, see what you think about it. I read a list of writing rules that a famous writer had used, and one of them was write in the middle of chaos. He used to just, I need to look up who the author was that said that, but he basically said he would write in the middle of chaos and just let the tornado happen around him, family and everything. And he's like the only writer I've ever heard do that. What
Yeah,
are
I
you?
don't know how you do that. It certainly doesn't work for audiobooks. All those low frequency, interruptions get in the recording. The
That's
dog
true.
barks outside.
But I gotta find that. I gotta find the name of that author real quick. What was it? It's on my wall because I love his rules for like working.
Do you work in chaos?
I no, I need extreme quiet. I can't find it. All right, it's terrible. It was like a top 10 authors and what they think about things, and it was it wasn't Hemingway. That's all I know. All right, so well, so I kind of wanted to ask about oh we talked about your process. We talked about voices. My dad wanted to know, how do you do so many voices? Like, how many voices do you do?
I mean, I don't know because you end up adding new ones all the time, depending on the demands of the book, you know, and the characters that are present. I think most narrators have kind of like they have like character actors in their head because there's only so many voices that like you can physically articulate. Um, but so I think a lot of us have character actors in our head that we will choose to cast in specific roles because it's a way to keep it straight too. When they show up 100 pages later, you're like, oh yeah, this is so and so. I know who this is, and I know where I need to put my voice to make this happen. Um, but like you're adding them all the time because all of a sudden you have a character that is 12 years old and a little girl and has a lisp, and I haven't done that
Yeah,
one before, so here you go. Here's a new character.
there we
So
go.
it's guided by the book to a certain extent.
Do you typically like record yourself all the time, or do you have anyone that helps you with that? I mean, are you kind of a one man show?
Just me all the time. Just me all the time. just continue to read straight through.
Do you have,
And
who helps you, like, do you have anyone that helps you with like the final cut, the editing, the production after
so
you've done your part?
I've been doing this so long that if I am independently producing the book, I am doing the editing on the fly. I have my process extremely streamlined at this point, and I'm fairly technically minded. So I always, for those productions, have a proofer. So there's always someone that I work with after the fact that makes sure I didn't mispronounce things and that everything is consistent and that there weren't any errant sounds that I missed. But as far as editing and mastering for independent stuff, I'm doing it because it doesn't take me significant time at this point, and it would be more time consuming and expensive for me to outsource it to somebody else. Um, for publisher productions, I'm really just recording raw audio. I give it off to them, and they have their own proofers that they hire and their own engineers that will do the final, cut of the audio. But I would guess at this point, I work with a lot of small publishers and quite a few direct authors that I've just worked with for a long time. And for those, that's probably 60% of the books I do full production on. I'm guessing, but I think it's about that.
That's impressive. That is a great ability to be able to just edit right as you're doing it. Probably
It's
saves a lot of time.
extremely handy. I have a very specific process at this point.
Very good. Well, one question that I got from a reader was, when you listen to your recordings, what is the experience like when you hear your voice back? Most people find the sound of their voice strange. How do you use that to inform your performance, or does it sound strange to you?
It stops sounding strange after a while. You
Yeah.
kind of learn as a narrator to love and be comfortable with your own voice, because if you aren't, you're not gonna
Yeah.
be able to perform particularly well. So I hear myself in my ears at very high levels all the time. So I'm constantly listening to myself. I hear myself back a lot. I never listen to a full book through after I performed it anymore because effectively I'm doing editing as I go. And that's just not no narrator for the most part has the time to do that. There's always some other book that needs to be done, and it's a better use of your time. But I listen to enough of myself back in mastered form that I know what I sound like and I'm fine with it, which is good because if it was painful
Yeah.
to hear yourself back all the time, it would be a really brutal job.
I can imagine. I
But
really
if I were to listen to like the first book I ever did, I'm sure I would cringe because I was much more self-conscious about it. And I think when you first start as a narrator, you feel like you are not enough, that you need to sound like more.
Yeah. Well,
But
you sound like a tortured artist. So welcome to the club. Time to start heavy drinking.
well, and later on,
No,
you don't worry about it. You can't worry about it because you just your voice has all kinds of imperfections and things, but they're just what makes it your voice. It's you. So eventually, you just want to sound like you, so that if somebody hears you, they're not like, "Oh, look, who is that? Is that other person that I really like?" No, you want them to hear me. I want
yeah,
them to know
it's
who I am, and I want it to sound like me and what I would do because
a
that,
feature, not a bug, right?
it's a feature, not a bug. Exactly.
So, what is your usual turnaround for a project? How long does it take you?
I usually these days complete 2.5 to 3 finished hours of audio a day. So a 10-hour book usually takes probably 4 days to record. Um, and then I'll have, probably just shy of a week in turnaround before I get my proof back. And then within a couple hours, it's done. Um, so it's fairly tight turnaround for independently produced books.
And that's
Really
four
tight,
days.
actually.
That's like soup to nuts. That's like
As
page
far
one to
as
last page.
that's done. The audio is mastered and edited, and all I'm doing is waiting for my pickups and any corrections I'm going to do, and I'll just slot those in, and then the book is final. Um, it takes a lot longer to actually get through the publication process than it does to record. So, I usually do 50 to 60 hours of audio a month, which usually works out to 4 or maybe 5 books a month, and just keep chugging through them. My Google
That's
Calendar is just a big bunch of magenta blocks.
So what is your process to stay productive? I know you mentioned, your fans and friends on Discord kind of keep you accountable.
And I work
Do you
regular
have
hours. I work
okay,
regular hours.
do
I
you
get
have a
up in the morning.
routine?
Yep, I usually work from 9 or 9:30 to about 11:30. Go have lunch, hour and a half lunch break. Come back, and then I'll work from 1 or 1:30 to 3:30, 4:30, and then I'm done for the day. So that's
Pretty
my
sweet.
production schedule. I don't spend an extraordinary amount of time doing prep, and like I said, I effectively do what I call a skim read. Um, a lot of narrators are very meticulous about their pre-reading, and they'll go and they'll mark up their script and they'll color code dialogue for specific characters, and they'll go to a level of note taking that I just don't do. But I'm a fairly good cold reader. Um, and I like to read that way, so it's to my advantage that I don't have to. I'm just lucky.
Yeah, I can identify with that because it's, some people, they ask you, as a writer, do you outline? Do you, what's your process? Do you know the whole story? And then you start writing. I think it's different for every artist, how you
I'm sure.
approach something. And in your case, you're kind of you like just on the fly, doing it live. Does that feel like a more visceral performance to you?
I'm I'm I enjoy it, which I think translates. I think
Right.
when you enjoy what you're reading and you're in it, and you're not like, yep, well, this is the part where this happens. I already read this. The way that you're reading what you've already written, and where you're kind of like
Yeah.
you're glossing over parts of it in your
Yeah.
mind because you already know what happens. I want that not to happen for me while I'm reading it, because if it does, then my brain goes on autopilot. And if because I already know what happens. So it's easier to disengage when I already know every little beat. Obviously, I have to know the big important things, especially if somebody turns out to have an Irish accent on page 472. But um
Oh, I'm sorry about that, by the way.
no, that's not, no, but it's just like the classic thing, like, well, and the worst is when it happens on book 4. But the character turns out
So
to have a squeaky voice and an Irish accent in book 4, but they've been talking for 3 books in their rough, Yorkshire up until then. Um, Narrators have lots of horror stories about that kind of thing. Um,
what can
anyway,
you do at that point? It's kind of just like, what? It's the painting is done.
yeah.
You'll just
And
have to wonder.
there have been cases where, um, you talk to the author and you're like, I'm just going to omit this line. Can we just agree that for the sake of your book, since there was no way to know this ahead of time and you didn't let us know, and it was impossible for me to have researched this, that we're just going to omit this line for right now? And some authors are on board with that. I've also had authors that accidentally assigned totally different accents to the same character, and fortunately we caught it before the book went to publication so that they could fix it.
Oh, that's
They
very
went
helpful.
from they were Belgian in book 1 and became Irish in book 3.
There's no getting around it. You write a lot of content, that's going to happen,
It
right?
happens. It happens.
At
So it's
least,
nice when you can catch it.
absolutely. That's super helpful for those writers, I'm sure.
Absolutely.
So I had a couple more questions from readers. Let me see. What's a good one here? Oh, yes. I want to know how he breathes. Does he just not breathe?
Oh, the
I never
breathing is a
hear
skill.
anything. It's so seamless.
Breathing is a skill. So for me, breathing is all about parking it inside of a phrase. So if the breath is naturally in a sentence or a phrase, your mind doesn't. I've breathed like 4 times during this sentence, but because it's part of the natural musicality of the phrase, you don't notice it. So as a
Right.
narrator, when you're taking your breaths at the appropriate pauses in a phrase where it feels naturalistic, you just don't notice them. People notice breaths when they come in the spaces between sentences or between paragraphs, and you get what's called a slash breath, where you start into the sentence with this gasp because you discover you didn't have the air to do it. Or you finish a long passage and then there's a big inhale. So those sorts of things, it's just a skill that you develop over time about how to place your breath in a way that isn't distracting. Because you don't want no breaths, because then you sound like a robot.
Right. Well, yeah, and I've listened to audiobooks that do kind of sound like that. There's almost a just very rigid, every sentence, every word sort of perfectly pounced on, and
Hmm.
you don't get that. That you want a level of organic.
Yes. Yes. And some studios will go through and remove breaths. It's like a pop of them. Um, I don't believe in that, but it is done in some places. I think it's better to just naturalistically get them done.
Sorry, I think I lost the audio there for just a moment. We were talking about you want some natural breath to be in there. You don't want it to sound too
Yeah.
robotic. And you were saying,
Some studios have like a policy of removing all breaths. I think in general, they're probably mostly doing it in between phrases where it's possible to, because if you're naturally doing it in the cadence of a sentence, it's a little more difficult to remove. But people breathe. We expect people to breathe. You should hear people breathe. Otherwise, it sounds weird. You find yourself
right?
not breathing and holding your own breath. It's like
We,
watching a movie where somebody's having to hold their breath underwater and you just find yourself holding your breath.
oh yeah, absolutely. You have that experience. I always get that. You don't want that would be very painful experience for the listener. Well, what do you think about like authors, speaking of painful experiences for the listener, what do you think about authors reading their like fiction authors reading their own narrations, doing their own audiobooks? Do you think that that
I
can
mean, there's
work?
authors that do it well. I think there's authors that do it well. Neil Gaiman does a great job.
Hmm.
Some authors are well suited to it. People who I think oftentimes they're probably authors who read aloud a lot, and
Hmm.
then they're doing live readings. And so they have that constant practice and that relaxation when they're doing it. So I think it can be done well. In general, if you were to just say in general, I think it's probably detrimental for the most part, but there's always
Yeah.
exceptions. But it takes work to be good at it, and it's a skill that's developed like any other. So if the author has spent the time developing the skill, they can probably be great at it. Um,
It's as fair
um,
an answer as that you can get, right? Yeah. Well, what else do I have? Do you do you like input on characters? Do you need a sort of show Bible to help you get started? I mean, I know you mentioned you kind of skim the novel. Is there anything else you need to sort of place how you're going to perform the work?
if it's important to the author and they've got it ready, I'm happy to have it because I want to please the author. I mean, that doesn't mean I'll always agree with him, just like the minor disagreement we had that we worked out and figured out. But we'll be doing it we'll both be coming from the perspective of trying to make it the best we can be for the listener. So I always want the author's input if they have it. Some narrators don't. They want to be
Hmm.
able to go and make those creative choices and have like a hard wall between. I don't generally think that way. Um, that's information that I want. But in the absence of any information, I'm happy to just take it on and do it. I enjoy it. So I don't feel like I'm at sea if I don't have that input, but I always want to have it if it's available.
Yes, we wouldn't want you lost at sea, especially doing a nautical book called Blood and Oak. um, I'm curious too about this. Are you more into narrative or do you prefer to do the dialogue? What's your favorite?
I think that they're both equally important. I think that they are all of a piece. I think the music of narrative needs to support dialogue. Dialogue needs to be human. And I kind of think of the narrative in a lot of ways like the soundtrack of a movie. And the way that it's delivered
Interesting.
has a musical quality that can support the tone of what the author is trying to achieve. So I think you ignore the narrative at your peril and you ignore the dialogue at your peril. Some people read dialogue like they read narrative, which is weird. And some people read narrative as though it isn't important. And I think they're both equally important.
That's a really interesting perspective because I love the way you did the narrative in Blood and Oak. It sounds so musical, and you have this way of kind of building to the crescendo and sort of landing at each key moment.
Yeah,
And
there's terrain that you're traversing. If you can, I'm often envision it as like, curves. Here's where we're going, and then we're coming down here. And there's all of these points where the narrative and the dialogue join are important transition points. Like just something as simple as blending into an attribution from something that someone says. One of the things that often bothers me in narration is when someone says something and then there's this long pause. He said, like he said is
Yeah.
important. He said is not important. This is the thing that the author just had to put there so you knew who it was. But as a
Right.
narrator, we're actually providing you with this information already. We've already pre-sold you on the he said because we're speaking it in character. You don't have to wait for the attribution to know who's speaking. You know. So the attribution wasn't important. So the more that we can kind of slip that in so that its importance is downgraded and that it becomes part of the delivery of that dialogue as it transitions back into narrative, the better, because you want that transparency. I don't want you to think about he said like it was important. It wasn't. So
Right.
there's all these little decisions about those bridge points between dialogue and narrative that I think are so important and that I end up thinking a lot about that.
And it's something that's fun for you to do, which, that if you weren't having that much fun doing it, you wouldn't have that kind of level of drama and peaks and valleys as you go
Yep.
through the performance.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, um, you once described Blood and Oak as sort of being Master and Commander meets Black Sails, which is one of the most flattering things I've ever heard about it, because I love both of those works. And my question is, I mean, did you like doing a historical work? Do you like period pieces?
Oh
Is
yeah.
that
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. I loved it. I think it's great fun.
awesome?
And because you had very modern style of dialogue. And I don't mean that is in like it sounds like they are from a modern era, but modern in your approach to characterization and dialogue and the way that they were naturally delivered as people who would actually speak to one another. Because so much
Right.
um, fiction that's written before a certain time has a kind of a stilted, sort of slightly dry dialogue delivery.
Yeah.
Um, a lot of it doesn't feel very immediate. It feels like somebody relating what somebody else said and writing it down after the fact. It loses a certain amount of immediacy. But you had a really great quality of immediacy and that sort of modern approach to dialogue, which really makes it very energetic to read, and it makes the human interactions a lot more enjoyable to read. So I had a great time with it, and combining that with a really interesting time period. And I mean, who doesn't like pirates and sword fights and ship battles? I mean, this is cool stuff.
That's
So
what I always tell people. The interesting thing about that too is I used to get that question. I still get that question a lot. Why do your characters have that modern kind of sound? And to me, it was, I sort of did. As my friend put it, I made a decision to deadwood the dialogue. Which, if you've seen the show Deadwood,
oh
they
yes.
deliberately changed a lot of the actual things people would say in a mid 1800s gold boomtown. They changed it to modern terms because they wanted the reader to connect, or the viewer I should say, connect to it
Yep.
in a real way.
You want it to be
So
you want to immediately relate to it. You want to get as close to it as you can get.
exactly. So I'm glad that that served kind of what you're doing, and it sounds like what you're doing, you want to bring that energy, and that's important to you. So
Yep. Very
what
much
what
so.
what else do I have? So where do you have a favorite book that you've narrated, like one that you just think that was my magnum opus?
I don't know. I mean, it's like picking between your children or something because I love all of them for a lot of. I've loved Blood and Oak, um, recommended it to tons of people. I I really
Much
enjoyed
appreciated, good sir.
I really enjoyed Will White's series. He's just writes books that are just purely fun to read. But I've read a bunch of books, and I'm always they've all got something. Part of the job is loving the books too, right? Um,
Yeah.
that doesn't mean that every get book you get is your favorite book because it's not, and obviously it can't be. But some of it is. For all the books, you find something that you love about it because you have to. That's the job. Is finding what did the author love about this? I want to make sure that that comes across. Um, I think that's a large part of it.
Yeah.
So
That's the job. I love it. And actually there was a moment like that in the book. One of those small, few and far between changes that I asked for, I remember, was there is a signature, kind of an important line in the middle of my book where Melisande, the woman in disguise as a sailor, declares the name that will become, for the rest of the series, sort of the nickname of my character, Bloody Sully. And she says, "Three cheers for Bloody Sully." And all I asked for was like more enthusiasm, because I just want this one to land like it's, over the
yep.
top, like, make me tell you to tone it down. And and your second take was great. I loved it. It was just, to this day, I hear that line in the audio and I'm like, Baldree nailed it.
Right on. I'm glad.
Because and for me, that was, you talk about, those are the things, you want the author to love the thing they love about it. That was exactly it. Great example of that.
Well, one of the best things you can ever do, one of the best feelings you can have, is if you can make an author laugh at their own joke.
That's good. I like that. I
Whenever an
think
author tells me that they laughed at their own joke, I'm like, yeah. Because comedy is tough.
it
Doing
is.
comedy requires really specific timing and inflection. And I mean, it's a skill. And if you can make the author laugh at it and you got what they were going for, especially if it's a subtle joke, that's always very rewarding.
I still laugh because I didn't think, when I was writing it, to put any music to the actual musical pieces, even though they were loosely based on real musical pieces of the time. And you actually sang music to the songs that the characters were singing, and that actually did get me laughing, because there was a couple of, it was like a lewd song,
Oh,
a
yeah, the
sailor
lewd song.
song.
Yep. Yep. Yep.
So how did you approach it? How did you come up with just music? You had nothing. I
I
didn't
just
give you
hum
anything, and you
something
just
until it was okay. And I do that in a few other books. In general, mostly when you're doing music, especially if you're doing it for a publisher, you don't sing anything because there's copyright concerns and performance copyright for music.
right.
And usually when people are referencing music, it's music that actually exists and is not in the public domain. Um, I in Blood and Oak, a couple of I think I can't remember the exact number of songs, but some of them were traditional songs. So I could go
Well,
and get
Under the Ash Grove, I
the
think, yeah,
Ash
that was a
Grove.
traditional song.
Yeah, and so I just looked up the actual song and
Yeah.
did that as is for the body the body song. I'm sure I just hummed something until I had something I was reasonably okay with. Um, and I've had to
It
do that
actually works pretty
since.
well. It fit the cadence of the lines
And
very well.
while I say it's sung as a woman pretending to be a man, then pretending to be another man, which made it a challenge. I've also had to do songs as a bird, a little small female bird singing a made up pirate shanty. So, I mean, it's not like it's the hardest thing I've ever had to do.
That kind of sounds like one of those interesting acting challenges they give you in
Yeah.
acting school. Like, yes, you are a tomato. Be the tomato. Be the small singing bird.
Sometimes they're interesting to figure out if they've got an interesting meter. It's just part of it. It's not like the whole book's a song. So, change of pace is always cool.
Very good. Well, how do you feel about where you are today compared to when you just started out narrating?
Well, I mean, when I just started out, nobody knew who I was, and I had to go hunt for books. So it's a lot different now, and you do it for a while. But I love it, probably more than when I started. And I just I just feel fortunate every day that I get to do it and that people are going to pay me to do this and that I get to read this variety of books and people come to me with cool stuff. So, I mean, I'm very
Pretty
grateful and
awesome.
I'm very grateful and feel really fortunate.
Very good. Well, do you have any advice for anyone that's interested in getting into narrating or getting into the audiobook industry?
Um, there's so much advice to give. The simplest one is to go to Narrator's Roadmap, which is a website that has a vast quantity of information on getting started. The other simplest starting information is go read a book out loud for several hours in a corner of your house and make sure you still like it. Because if you don't
Not
like
bad.
that, don't do it and don't waste the money getting started. There's all kinds of technical things to take into account. But the simplest is you're going to have to invest a little bit of money to get some equipment. You need a space to record, which doesn't echo, which is one of the most important things you can do. So if you get a walk-in closet with clothes, you're ahead of the game. but you can't go recording in your bathroom. And just really, really want to do this. There are lots of coaches out there that you can speak to if you are getting into audiobook narration that can give you kind of some a bit of a lift figuring out what you need to work on. But it's a really cool industry. I love it. The people in it are fabulous. So I certainly wouldn't discourage anyone unless, again, you don't like reading out loud for a few hours.
Yeah, it's good advice. And you're saying sit in that corner and do not leave, continue reading, do not stop for like
Yeah,
hours
read
or
read for a few hours. Yeah, because that's the job, you know.
yeah. If you can't do the job,
If you can't
get
do,
out of
and there's you build up resilience over time. There's stamina that you build up doing it, just like anything else. I mean, this is all muscles, you know. You learn how to do it, but some of it is also just the mindset of sitting someplace and reading out loud, you know. And if you don't like doing that, don't go down
yeah.
that road.
Well, are there any projects you're working on or anything that you want to plug or that you're teasing that for your fans?
Not really. I mean, I'm really transparent of what I'm doing at all times, and there's always the books that I'm working on are always public on my Discord server. Um, it, it's a new book every week, so there's
Nice.
always something coming out, and I'm always having a good time doing it. So
All right, cool. Well, I think I pretty much got through all my questions. It was really interesting talking to you, and I'm so glad you took the time. And
it's great to talk to you too. This is the first time I think we've ever spoken vocally in
I
year,
know.
at all.
What do you think? How's it sound?
Sounds fabulous. Sounds fabulous.
Nice. Yeah. It's kind of a weird experience for me too, because I've heard your voice so many times in my audiobook. And I don't mind admitting this. I love my own writing because I write what I wish I could read a lot of the time, or I write that movie that I haven't seen that I want to see. And then
Yeah,
I hear your narration of it, and I'm like, this is a really good book.
it is a really good book. More people should read it and or listen to it.
Well, I appreciate it, Travis. And anything else you want to share or other thoughts you have for the world?
No, I mean, stay safe, wear your masks.
Yes.
Sayonara 2020.
Yes, yes, and don't come back 2020. All right, Travis. Well, it was good talking to you, man. I appreciate it.
Thanks a lot,
Thanks
Garrett.
so much. All right, good luck with everything.
Take care.
All right, bye.